In today's video, we'll be discussing a precellular ecosystem that would have eventually formed in the origin of life. Hi, my name is Eduardo Hernandez. I am the creator of Emergent Chemical Evolution, the newest theory on the origin of life. I'm also the author of the book by the same name, available in all major online retailers. Let's get on with the video. Being that the chaos engine is in place and it is churning and taking in its currents all the components available in the ocean, like I claimed previously, this would be similar to a cytoplasm found today within cells, within the liquid medium of cells. Those components that would have been produced by the chaos engine would have easily created an ecosystem, meaning that certain components would depend on other components and be more susceptible to work in different parts of what at that time would be the only ecosystem that's of any importance, would be the ocean itself, where these components are suspended. That's why I feel that it's unnecessary for any cavities in rock surfaces or any volcanic vents. I mean, they do, the only function of volcanic vents I could see having is providing basic pH, helping to create the basic pH conditions needed for certain amino acids to take a certain conformation or to bond, because the range of amino acids, activation of bonds range from 2 pH all the way to 9 pH. So that range is necessary for the amino acids that life uses to be activated. So the volcanic vents providing that basic pH in the depths of the ocean to help create that gradient within the entire oceans was necessary. So that being said, depending on where you are in the ocean is the part of the ecosystem that these components would find themselves in. These precellular components would be free-floating, would not have any direct control mechanism at the beginning, where they would be just jostling in the oceans, just activating and deactivating depending on which pH they find themselves in. Eventually, you would have systems in place that would benefit each other. Remember that the entire ocean, the entire globe, is susceptible to the pH gradients. So anywhere there's a current taking components through different depths of the ocean, you have an occurrence of the chaos engine. So every inch of this planet would have been susceptible to currents, and those currents passing through the pH gradients all over. So those components, no matter where they find themselves on the globe, would find themselves in a favorable condition to be activated and unactivated depending on where they find themselves in the pH gradient. The amino acids will be activated to further elongate those strips of amino acids, polypeptides, and then the RNA themselves as well would have the ability to take different conformations depending on the pH they find themselves, to elongate, to contract, to make it easier for them to be replicated, not to be replicated depending on where they find themselves in the pH. You can see that, and the ability of these components to be activated and deactivated depends on their sequence. So that means that a polypeptide of amino acids of a certain length, depending on its sequence, would be activated at a different pH than a similar polypeptide of equal length but of a different sequence would be activated in. So some would be activated in a negative, well, not negative, in a more acidic 2 or 3 pH, whereas the other one of similar length would not be activated at the pH. It would have to go to a lower depth of a higher pH to be activated. So you'll have that type of cyclic activity all around the globe, happening with all different types of components, interacting with different types of RNA segments. So you would easily form an ecosystem, a precellular ecosystem, that would make it very conducive for viruses to propagate. Viruses self-assemble, whereas cells don't. Viruses just need certain components to be in the vicinity of each other to then interact and self-assemble. That is a very, very beneficial a beneficial characteristic to have, to be able to further evolve and to become a more complex virus within this precellular ecosystem. This precellular ecosystem, like I said, would mimic the cytoplasm of modern cells. I mean, the components and the ingredients would be almost exactly comparable, because it's a slightly acidic, slightly saline solution that would have all the components available at that time for organic activity. There will be no animals scooping up all the resources of the ocean as they are today, or that occurred once life took off, animal life anyway. So it's very easy to see that being the cyclic nature of the ocean's currents, and being that the earth is entirely covered with ocean for a very long time, you would have some kind of cyclic system in place for an ecosystem to evolve, where certain components would be more active at a certain time, a certain place, depending on the pH of that certain place. So within the three-dimensional sphere of the ocean at that time. So that would have been very conducive to the evolution of viruses. Not only, like I explained in the previous video, that certain RNA strips would evolve to have information for beneficial proteins for itself, which eventually would encapsulate that RNA. You would also have encapsulation systems that would be different from each other depending on the random addition of RNA to these RNA sequences that would garner different proteins with different characteristics. So certain proteins would tightly encapsulate their RNA strip, like tobacco mosaic virus. You would have other excuse me. You would have other proteins that would form isocohedral encapsulations or amorphous encapsulation of the RNA, creating hence different viruses. Now, the chemistry of these encapsulations at this point would be almost universal. They wouldn't be much different, because all you have is proteins which are composed of amino acids that would encapsulate RNA, so that these types of mechanisms would be interchangeable, or at least in certain cases compatible, where you could have mixing of different RNA information and different viruses evolving from mixture. Eventually what you would have is specific types of encapsulation and specific types of proteins that would be incompatible, and therefore would create totally different types of viruses, which I explained in the previous video, would create different lineages, allowing different modes of evolution to occur, and therefore they would become more complex in different ways. You'll have different viruses that have different systems of replication, the means by which they replicate their RNA. One in particular is what's the name of that virus? Yeah, I was right. The reovirus. The reovirus has an encapsulation, a double encapsulation of its RNA information. It has within the larger encapsulation of the virus. Within itself, it has a more compact encapsulation of its RNA. And when it replicates, its RNA is extruded through the pores of its inner membrane. It exactly mimics the type of system we see with our nucleuses, where the RNA is translated within the nucleus and then is extruded through pores of the nucleus to the outer cytoplasm of the cell, where it does its work of creating proteins when it interacts with ribosomes. So you can see that viruses contain all the components necessary to further evolve and eventually become a cell. Now, here's the thing with cells. Cells cannot self-assemble. Their membranes are embedded with proteins that do two things: control the flow of material in and out of the membrane, and help stabilize the membrane and keep its structure. Now, here's the thing: the parts of the membrane that encapsulate it in a cell are fatty acids that have a polar component that is water loving, and a component that is water. Well, you have hydrophilic and which are hydrophilic, which is water loving, and hydrophobic, which doesn't like the water and tries to get away from it. So that allows it to interact and create the membrane. Now, here's the thing: that is an organic molecule that is not, I mean, it's produced by proteins, but it's not controlled by proteins, in the sense that there isn't a protein that comes and puts it in place to where it needs to be. The physical chemical reaction of those components, of that molecular molecule, allow it to, once it's produced by proteins, to fall into place and expand the membrane. So the DNA is not a program. All DNA does is create proteins that then do activities that control and create the environment of the cell. So it only, for me, that points to viruses being prior to cells, because they are strictly protein encased. So that would eventually lead to where a virus would get large enough where it would produce a protein that creates these fatty acids that would eventually incorporate itself into the capsid of the virus, and then become a membrane, where it would be an encapsulation with fatty acids and proteins, and those proteins creating the rigidity to maintain the integrity of that encapsulation, and eventually those proteins further evolving into proteins that would allow material to come in and out of the virus, which by the example of the Mimi virus could become extremely large, extremely complex before it evolves, or, well, evolves the complexity and has the need to control the input and output of material within its encapsulation. So I would see that with time, and in the ecosystem of the oceans at that time, the ecosystems, you can have viruses doing certain jobs, depending on what part of the environment they find themselves, that will be beneficial to other viruses within the ecosystem, within the ocean. And therefore you would have these type of viruses becoming more complex in providing what it is that they specialize in, and other ones becoming more dependent on those, and vice versa. And you can have this cyclic system. Therefore, you don't have a total consumption of the resources in the oceans. You would have, what happens all the time is cyclic systems forming, where you would have certain organisms use up resources and provide other resources that then another organism, another virus, could take and utilize. Remember that these organisms, the viruses, they within the cytoplasm or the ecosystem of the ocean at that time would, if depending on where they find themselves in the pH, would disassemble and replicate. And in that would require components that might have been created by other viruses that would have assisted it in its replication and its growth, quote unquote growth, in its accumulation of further genetic information. So that ecosystem could have created all types of cyclic systems that would eventually show up in cells, which could be the creation of ATP, the creation of correcting systems for the correction of RNA replication, the self-assembly of viruses could take multiple forms during this time, whereas certain viruses would be replicated at one point, and only when it reaches a certain area, a different area of the ecosystem with a different pH, would it assemble. And that wouldn't occur when certain components are present from other viruses. So where we see evidence for something like that, in that there are certain viruses that will not work unless there's a presence of a second virus or a different type of organism. They're called satellite viruses. So that is one of the ways I see that system evolving. Whereas a virus entering into a cell, or a cell spontaneously producing a virus, and a virus that requires another virus to function, the odds of that is unsurmountable, untenable for that system to have been able to propagate. I think it's much easier starting from an ecosystem that allowed for viruses to propagate and to evolve codependence on each other, and then eventually certain viruses will become so complex that they transitioned into cells. But that would all depend on the precellular ecosystem garnering the environment to first allow viruses to easily replicate and evolve and become further complex, where then once cells came into the picture, where viruses became large enough with complex structures within itself to then evolve and take that step into becoming cells, then you would have the problem of less components being available in the environment, because these cells would start consuming and encapsulating within themselves the resources of the environment. And that's the subject for another video. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the information. Hope it sparked some curiosity and opened your mind into new ideas of how viruses are related to us, where we are the progeny of viruses. They are our direct ancestors. You buy it or don't, that's where the evidence points for me. That's what I present in my book, and the evidence I gathered from published articles from established scientists, the leading scientists in their field, and these are articles from accredited journals. So if you're not convinced, pick up my book, check my references, and argue me about it. I would love any challenge to my theory. I am not going to be tied to any sacred cows, any dogma that I have to believe in this particular way. I mean, what I started out with before this theory, I totally scratched. I had an idea that entropy had something to do with taking biological molecules and reacting in the oceans in certain ways that I eventually found were untenable. And once I found out how life is sustained, when I learned how to become a nurse, then that gave me the clue to the solution, and everything started falling into place. So that's what the purpose of these videos are, is to lead you along into the theory. And till the next time, thank you.